conference on modeling of social phenomena. We're going to have a number of speakers today. I will not be introducing each one of them in detail. However, the very first speaker is Franciszek Krakowski, and he's going to be talking to us about the modeling of the spread of COVID in the Polish population. Franciszek?
Good morning, everyone, from my side. Thank you very much for a kind invitation. A certain time ago, I didn't realize that agent-based modeling will become such important part of my scientific and professional life. But when I'm looking on what I'm doing right now, scientifically and not only, it is mainly based on the agent-based modeling, even more than on artificial intelligence and other techniques. So I'm very happy that I can share with my knowledge and experience today and tell you about the adventure of modeling the COVID-19 epidemic in Poland. The whole story dates back to 2008, when, as the young postdoc, I started the project at ICM, which was devoted to building the virtual, the synthetic social structure of Poland, in order to build the simulator for the influenza epidemic. Nobody was thinking at that time about the real danger which can come from COVID, but fortunately we have prepared a very complex and very advanced simulation environment for studying the epidemic processes, and thanks to that we started to simulate the COVID-19 epidemic, having already a synthetic society, synthetic population done. We can think of my lecture on three steps and three maybe layers. The first layer or first step, I will introduce our synthetic society, which is a pretty separate entity from the epidemic simulation, separate that it may serve for many other purposes than the epidemic simulation. Then I will tell you something about the mechanism, how to simulate the infections, so the epidemic processes, and then I will discuss about the result. So the first couple of slides will be about the synthesis of the virtual population that we have made. So the central idea of the model is that we want to create a detailed representation of the demographic and sociological structure of Poland, combined with the probabilities of virus transmission. So we have 38.3 million of agents in our model. Each agent is localized spatially in his household, and we have those agents grouped in contexts. The contexts are the households, schools, so the places of permanent or quasi-permanent contacts, physical contacts, that agents are having among each other. Then we have also a transportation module, so train, cars, and daily commutation, which is responsible for long and short distance travels to mix the agent up during the epidemic and during our simulation. Maybe I will. Okay, so step 0 before all other steps is the landscape of data that are needed for this kind of quite big simulations. For the sake of simplicity or clarity, I like to divide them into 3 categories, 3 pillars. The first one are the data responsible or which enable us to recreate the synthetic society, so the social structure data. And those are stationary data which are coming from different institutions, like for Census Bureau, from PESEL database, from REGON database, from different statistics which are telling something about the transportation size or volume in Poland, and they are pretty independent from the epidemic perspective and epidemic related tasks. And there are, of course, particular for a given territory and country. The second category of data, the second pillar on which the model is based, those are the universal data about the COVID-19 illness and the illness course and the biology of the virus. So, of course, the human organism and the virus are to some extent everywhere the same, and the interaction between the virus and the human organisms are similar. So, for example, the transmission, the virulence, so the number of viruses that are produced of given type, the course of the illness, so the day from the infection to the onset of the symptoms, are replicable from country to country. So we can collect the data from any population, any territory, and apply them to Polish situation. And the last pillar, this is the third one, are the country-specific data about the particular course of the epidemic in Poland. And it, of course, consists of the statistics that all of us know about the confirmed cases, the hospital beds occupation, number of quarantined people, but the second point, so the dark feature estimation, is also very crucial, and it differs from country to country. Dark feature, probably most of you know what is the dark feature. We realize that the confirmed cases is only a small part of each of all cases, which infected cases, which all people which are infected every day. So the ratio between the confirmed cases, so detected cases, and the real number of cases vary from country to country. And in Poland, we know, after some seroprevalence data, that the average ratio was around 5.5. So 5 times more infections we have than are said in the newspapers. So, for example, today, if they say that we have 20,000 infections, today we can be sure that we have more than 100,000 infections in Poland. And for example, in Germany, this factor is around 2.5. In England, also around 2.5, because it depends on the politics of the testing and also the culture of the population, how likely they are to go to the medical doctor. Okay, so those are some pictures about our virtual Poland. So this is the density of the population. Here we see Warsaw. Here we are here in Białystok. The map is impressive. When I saw this map several days ago, I was really very impressed by that, and I spent many hours of gazing at it and seeing what is the stamp of the history on that. Because here those are the former German territories, so with the secondary population process, and we see that the density of population is much lesser than in the rest of the Poland. Here is the most densely populated region, and so on and so on. A lot of insight might come from just study the density of population distribution in Poland. And here is the example of the epidemic spread, which is not taken from the COVID one. It is the old one from the influenza, but we can see that if we seed some initial infections somewhere in Poland, the epidemic spread out over the whole territory of the country, and we can see how many infected, how many recovered are in our grid nodes, which are 1 square kilometer of the size. So those are our grid. And the huge amount of work was done also by Philip here and my team during this year, because we need to update the social structure. That was the old one, based on the data from 2010. And now we realize that we need to have it brand new, and we spend a lot of time, and we built a new simulator. This is on our video wall, animation of the new social structure of Poland. Here is the Hel Peninsula. This is the Warsaw, and our new social structure exceed beyond the needs of the epidemic simulator. So we have the household localized, for example, to the address points, and we can see, for example, the content of the household displaying the names of the agents which are living here in our twin Poland replica. Of course, the names are fake names, but there is a very funny generator of the names which sounds like Polish names and foreign names. So we can see who is living here, and most of the people living in the same house, they share the same forename. They differ by names, and of course the genders are also marked. So I advertise this product as a great tool for doing many different studies and simulations, not only the epidemic, but also the social and many others. And it will be publicly available under open source license, and we will be very happy if someone will use it. It is already being used by Polski Zakład Higieny, so the institution which is responsible for public health, for doing some public health related analysis for Poland. So those are next just visualization of our society. This is one visualization which I like very much. This we see the hole here and the lacking piece of territory here, and the good visualization can serve for debugging. That was the bug in our code. We have forgotten to place to locate agents here, and we see black holes, and of course it is fixed already. But this is the proof that the visualization can work quite well for debugging purposes. And this is the example of the analysis which was done for this public health institution. Sorry, I don't remember the name in English. This is PZH, the abbreviation, and those are distances from to the not distances the okay, maybe let's say distances to the closest POZ. So this is the basic health care unit in Poland. So they wanted to know what is the distribution of POZs in Poland and what are the distances, what can be improved in governing this of these assets. Okay, so let's make next step. Next step 2 is about the mechanism of the epidemic spread. So we look more in detail into our agent. So our agent can be in several states, and this is the agent-based model, but this is also the type of the SERR model. So the most common epidemiological models usually treated by the in terms of differential equations, but here the basic assumption is that the agent is in one of those states. So the first state is the susceptible state. So with the totally lack of antibodies inside and susceptible to the infection. The second state, which might happen to the agent, is incubation. There is not fortunate name exposed coming from different context, but in our context this is just the incubation. So the moment, the period when the agent is infected but not infectious yet. Okay, then it might come into two different states. This is the infectious non-symptomatic or mild symptomatic, and infectious with symptomatic. And from that there is a diagram of different states. It might go to hospital, to the intensive care unit, and unfortunately might die, and of course fortunately might be recovered and be back to the population. And this diagram is governed by the so-called table, which we call a state timetable matrix, which define the probabilities which are behind each of this arrow, of course, in different age groups separately. So we have at least 10 matrices to describe those probabilities for each group separately, because only age, group separately, and for different virus variant separately. Okay, so but those arrows are, I mean, the easier part, but still needed to very extensive literature search to parameterize them. But the whole, engine is behind this arrow. So the whole simulation, which is run, is computing the probability of the infection of given agent, and we do it using this formula with the time step equal to 1 day. So at the end of each day, we compute the probability of being infected by the agent which were met in different contexts. And this is the exponential formula, so it goes from 0 to 1, okay? And the argument of this function is composed of the infectivity of the contexts in which a given agent was present at a given day. So every time he was present in his household, and to some extent it was present in other contexts, which are here numbered from 1 to number of contexts, and this II stand for the infectivity of the school, of the kindergarten, of the workplace or transportation means, which in which the agent was present of the given day. Since the agents are spatially distributed, it is quite easy to present this all the states on the map, and this is quite useful because if you want, it's not visible here. Sorry, because this is of the projector, of the beamer. But here we can present what is the distributions of the susceptible, and what is the most interesting is what is the most probable distribution of the hospitalized or needed of those who need hospitalization agents. Okay, and that was all easy and good to that moment, up to the moment when the new variant and the reinfections came into the play. When this happened, the old diagram must be it's getting complicated, and it looks like that. So this is more or less the same story that was presented on the previous diagram, and then from the naturally immunized state, it can be reinfected based of the conditional probability, which depends on the initial time of the initial infection in the variant of the initial infection. And the same is for the vaccinated people. So the probability of infection, so this breakthrough infections, depend on the time of getting the dose and the type of the dose that you got. Okay, and of course the fact of infection or vaccinations also modifies the probability of going into symptomatic or asymptomatic state. So not only it acts two times. First of when the probability of infection is computed, the second time when the probability of the state, either symptomatic and non-symptomatic, is computed. And for behind that probabilities, we use such a data and such a formula. So first we modify the original Pj0 probability by the factor which depends on the cross immunity, so the zero cross immunity. So the factor which is telling what is the immune response of the antibody generated by the previous variant to the incoming variant, and the decay or degradation of the immunity in time. So now we are working heavily on searching the right parameters for Omicron for that part. And if we found them, we can say that we can compute the scenario for Omicron. Right now, we assumed several possible values, and we have already submitted to the government the simulation with the Omicron, but just guessing those values. So it's just giving the palette of the possible scenario, what might happen. Okay, so this is PDF, and I have forgotten that I put here a movie. So maybe I will show you the movie later on. This is the PDF which is showing how good the model was in the predictions. It is taken from the ECDC and Polish-German Forecast Hub, the service which is led by ECDC and Karlsruhe University, which is collecting many tens of the forecasts from different groups and comparing them between each other, building an ensemble forecast and validating them against the data. So in general, our forecast went really good. We had three points that we missed the right forecast. The first one was in between this. Maybe I will show it on the another slide. This is the shortage of the forecast. So this is the beginning of the epidemic in Poland. This is the first wave in autumn last year. This is the second wave in spring last year, and this is predicted wave. The prediction was done in September, and as we see, was this prediction, which was done 2 months ago, was quite accurate. But anyway, first we missed the prediction here because of the lack of knowledge about the real seroprevalence data. So we didn't know what is the ratio between the real and confirmed cases, and we overestimated the ratio of real cases, and that's why the social immunity was too high in our model, and we underestimated this wave. Second was the mistake of the lesser meaning, because we didn't take into account seasonal effect, because we didn't know whether it is real or fake effect, and we have predicted a higher number of infections here, not the peak, but just the higher number of infections. And the third one, that was not a big mistake. During this wave, we underestimated the influence of the beginning of the academic year. But that was not the global effect, but just some underestimation of the local trend. But the global picture given was okay. So we produce from each simulation, we produce a very detailed report, which is done automatically, proudly made by Janek Kisielewski from this building. So it automatically takes the whole simulation track and produces tens of the pictures and analysis, saying, I'm talking about you, saying thank you, showing what is what are the causes, what are the the properties of the internal degrees of freedom, internal variable of the population in the epidemic situation. So those are the exemplary ones. For example, this is the predicted course of the epidemic break down into voivodeships, and this is maximum number of cases hospitalized death during the second wave. So this is the report from our forecast from 2 months before. So you can see that the global picture is in a good agreement what was with the situation that happened in the reality, and the same analysis for confirmed cases and hospital beds. This is a comparison because our model is the very not numerous model, which also can give an insight what is going on in the regional scale. Most of the model are the global one or for the country, and we see due to this geo-referential construction also what is going in the local scale. We do calibrate the model to the global variables. We do not calibrate the model to the local variables. So if there is an agreement between the local trends, between model and reality, it is somehow self-adaptation coming out just from the proper synthetic structure of our society. And we are very curious how good we are in this context. I mean, from this perspective. And this is the on the powiat level, because this is the lowest level that data are available, we can see what is the agreement of the epidemic course in our model and in the reality. And this is next analysis done by Janek here, which is the showing the RMSD, so the measure of the distance of the agreement between profiles of the epidemic in powiats, and we see that most of them are quite good, some of them are less good, and there are some outliers which are totally different than the model shows. And this is the map showing of the good agreement and lesser agreement. Something is wrong going here on the Podkarpackie, and we think that the model is good, but the data are wrong. So in Podkarpackie the local dark feature ratio is higher than the for Poland. So we the model overestimate, no, not the over, give the higher predictions than actually there are confirmed cases, which is seen, for example, here on the Podkarpackie. Podkarpackie stopped in the half of the peak of predicted peak in our model, and Lubelskie and Podlaskie went well. So I mean, it supports the hypothesis that the detection rate in Podkarpackie is much lesser than in the. They don't examine themselves. I mean, they don't go to doctor, and they die in a home, in houses, in homes, not in the hospitals. And I think that the scale of the epidemic on Podkarpackie is much larger than it is now shown in the data. And we will see in the exceed excess of deaths numbers after several weeks. So we are looking at that very carefully to see what was the real size of the epidemic on Podlaskie. Okay, next. I don't know how much time do I have from now. 20 minutes. 20 minutes more. Okay, so maybe this is just the report of our tough battle during the instituting the first lockdown in Poland. The three exemplary predictions that were sent to the government when they are trying to choose the lockdown strategy that was in September, in October in 2020. So and finally this one was selected for we don't know how much it was based on our analysis, but at least we know that they were looking at those analyses and somehow discussing it. And those are very. Then I will. Oh, sorry. Now I will would like to show you some more detailed analysis which may be taken out of our simulator. This is progression and change of the dominant variant in the following waves. So since we are tracking our agents and we know what is the variant that given agent is infected, we can see what is the dominant variant in the population, and we can see what is the profile of the change of the switch from variant to variant. And this profile is directly comparable to the data that are gathered by the GSAID. So this is quite often situation that we are not able to parameterize the basic parameters or calibrate the basic parameters, but we are able to compare the observables coming from our models on a certain level of generality to the observables, or to the data gathered or collected by measurements. And this is the case that we can measure the progress of the share of the new variant which is coming into population, and the same profile we can see from our model, and we can compare those profiles. We can also display or see the age structure of the infections. So if since our agents are stratified by age, we can see what is the age structure of infections, and probably we can compare it with the seroprevalence data in different age groups. We haven't done it yet, but we plan to do it. So we have plans for years to make the different comparisons which are coming out of this epidemic, all the data and the simulations that we have. We have, of course, the infections break down into place of living place, so the villages, small, large cities, and so on. What we can see right now, we are very focused very much on the reinfections and breakthrough infections process. So we are taking the numbers of the reinfections from the Ministry of Health, and we are trying to compare them with the number of reinfections which occur in our model. It is also possible. This is somehow problematic because not all infections were recorded in the history, and then only part of those which are going on right now are marked as reinfections. So the better indicator for that is the number of vaccinated people which are hospitalized, and this is, key factor that for us for calibrating the cross immunity and breakthrough infections. So the number of vaccinated people which are in hospital right now, and this is more or less 27% of all those which are hospitalized right now are vaccinated. So this is from first view, this is high number, but if you realize that most of them are from the older age groups, and the older age groups are highly vaccinated, of course it becomes more rational that it is from the first side. And maybe that's all. Thank you very much. Let's leave some minutes for discussion. Thank you for a great to the great team that was established around this project. We have 12 people on board, computational scientists, physicists, but also psychologists. Janek Kisielewski from here, Philip, which is present here. Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm open to discussion and questions.
I've read some studies showing that the huge spread in transmission of the virus between the people. For example, the probability of infecting other people in the same household was estimated as about only 16%. 80% of infected people did not transmit the virus further. So, with reproduction rate about 2, it's 90% of infections caused by 20% of infected people. How this spread is reflected in your models? Did you incorporate it, or was there any result of modeling reflecting this, or maybe you think it is not true?
No, it might be true. I mean, all the thing is governed by the by the coefficients, there are alphas and betas in our model. Okay, and of course the situation that you are describing, it is possible in our model. We didn't check it out whether, I mean, the detailed feature, the detailed results fits or matches with the data that you are giving, but it is in front of us. As I said, we have, a huge list of the comparisons which can be done to prove or to calibrate better the model. We are, I mean, maybe one general remarks. We are pretty sure. I mean, we are very sure that the picture that we are getting from the simulations, it's not fully true picture of the epidemics. I mean, some effects compensate each other. So we can say that, for example, the transmissions go more by schools and kindergarten, but in reality they go more by, you know, shopping malls. And we do not know how to calibrate it. But since the restrictions are coming in groups, I mean, they probably compensate each other, and we do not know what is the share. So we can then try to investigate by looking at the age groups, by looking at the seroprevalence data, by fitting those detailed effects to the data. But yes, for sure, many of the detailed effects are different, and in our model, when we calibrate the profile to the accurate data, there is a internal compensation effect. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So I understand you don't take into account these super spreaders, yes?
Not so much. No, not so. Of course, the distribution. We have computed the distribution. How many persons are infected by one, and we didn't see, you know, heavy tail in that distribution. But of course, the spreaders differs from each other. So there are agents which infected one, and there are agents which infected 10 people. So in that sense, we have a super spreader, but this is, you know, probably this distribution ends at 10, not 100 or 1,000, because we do not have such a, you know, super spreaders, such a mechanism.
Okay, other questions, please. If not, I certainly have about a dozen. So, first of all, did I hear you correctly that you said that in your model you have 38 million agents?
Yes, 30. Yes, so this is, you know, one-to-one.
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 Okay, well, for that, immediately, my thought is, okay, how many different variables do you have for each agent? And what kind of computing resources do you have to be able to run this model?
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is not so super tough. Not our super tough computations relating to those that we were looking at with VTech, for example, that Piotr Magielski is doing from the quantum chemistry or nuclear physics. I mean, so we are used to the computations that, for example, one run takes 2 weeks on the Titanus supercomputer with thousands of CPUs. So we use right now one node of our supercomputer, which has 64 CPUs, and one run takes approximately 2.5 hours. 500 days, and it is written in a shared memory architecture, and each right now the simulation code, so the engine which lies over the social structure, is written in C, pure C, so it's pretty fast, and the attributes of agents are, of course, age, the immunological history, and the assignment to the context. So the loop goes every day over all 68 millions of agents, looking for the contexts. So checking which is the infectivity of the context, computing the probability for this for being infected. Yes, so this is just computing 38 millions of such a formulas every day. So this is not. Maybe Philip wants to tell something more about it.
Just one short comment. The part that creates the society is a bit separate from the part that runs the computations, and the society is much richer than what we're using in the simulation. So we actually have this pre-processing step when I think the pattern is called walled garden in the enterprise, where we have this model and then we produce another from the original one. So we flatten some data. For example, when we have a prison, we know more about this prison at the society level, and then we turn it into really a lot of connected households. So there's a simplification going on.
All right, well, we still have a couple of minutes. Oh, okay.
The question about you partially have answered that, but I mean, there's the most interesting part about the parameters of your model. How many parameters do you have, and how you estimate these parameters, and how you estimate the sensitivity of the model on these parameters. Because what we have done with Krzysztof, mostly Krzysztof has done, and I only had some stupid questions. So we see that the results can be very, very different estimates of. We try to estimate only just prevalence, yes. And that was sufficiently difficult problem to estimate prevalence, because there were so many parameters that we didn't know about, and we didn't have data for that. And I guess if you want to run the entire simulation, you have many more parameters, and their dependencies are even more complicated. So how you deal with that?
Oh my God! So this is, of course, so. First of all, we make an educated guess of the rational range of the parameters. Then we are doing that step by step. For example, this parameter alpha, we calibrate to the initial profile of the wave, which was in Poland, because we believe that it reflects the natural or initial transmissibility of the virus. Then those parameters beta are responsible for transmissibility in different contexts. So the calibration is mostly done by hand. So we have a good huge table, and we can easily turn off and turn on the beta coefficients, which refer to restriction, closing and opening the schools, for example. But within that region from 0 to 1, we can think that, or we can say that the transmissibility in the schools is not 1, but maybe due to some effects that we don't know, is, for example, 0.7. So we calibrate those transmissibility, just checking different variants and learning from the historical course of the epidemic what it might be. So we are just gaining the experience from month to month, what is the most probable range of that parameters. And it is not, we were attempting many times to formalize that or to try to automatize that process, but we failed. I mean, it is not possible. So this is more like an engineering-based approach, or engineering approach, rather than a very formal sensitivity analysis and fitting and to the data, as it was usually done during our papers from molecular dynamics. Okay, so we are just in many situations we are using our expertise, our knowledge, our intuition, and we usually are in the good in the good values, but we just fill the model good enough. This is due to the story about those parameters, and the rest of the parameters are just taken from the literature. So we, for example, we know what is the alpha of delta. Sorry, alpha. This is our parameter, and delta. This is the variance. So there is alpha of alpha and alpha of delta. So we know what is the proportion between alpha of alpha to alpha of delta from the literature. It's 2. So we just take the alpha for delta twice as the alpha for alpha was. So some are coming from the literature, the times are coming from the literature, the probabilities different are coming from the literature, and this is what is not available from literature. We tune it by hand, and then we verify it by studying this internal variables, like this one, looking whether the profile is in good accordance with the models, because the profile is steered by the, for example, cross immunity of delta to alpha. So this is the way we do.
Okay, so the question regarding possible alternative approach, I don't say, maybe it's simply real world, you don't have time for that, but maybe you could simply run, for example, 1000 simulations parallel with and adjust parameters with a genetic algorithm, or try to run the machine learning analysis, the 1000 simulations parameters, check what range of parameters makes sense.
So we plan to do that, to fork, for example, at certain moment of simulation, to fork and to scan the many parameters value, and we expect that we will end with many parameter sets which fits well to the all observables that we have. So we will not be able to finally define the one and the only one parameter set which explain the profile and the rest of the observables that we have from our model. But there is no time for such a game, for such a play, when doing the forecast for the operational purposes of the government and so.
Okay, look, I still have questions. I'm sure others do also, but we need to move on. So thank you very much. I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. My name is Konrad Telman-Kamiński. I am the head of the Society and Cognition unit here at the University of Białystok. And we are currently running a fairly large project on trying to model several different aspects of secularization, which is what I and the next speaker will be talking about. The next speaker, the main modeler for the project, and he is based at Norse in Kristiansand in Norway. Now, I'll be talking about the general outline of the project, whereas Ivan will talk about a couple of the main models that we have already developed and what results they have provided us with. So, I'll begin with a question. Now, over the last couple of years in Poland, we've seen what, from a sociological point of view, is quite an interesting phenomenon, in that we've had a growing awareness of the very rapid process of secularization that Poland is undergoing. And at the same time, we've had quite strong social protests to various changes in Polish laws that have been put forward by the Polish government and, for the most part, supported by the Catholic Church in Poland. So one of the questions that people have been asking themselves is to what degree these protests are a result of the process of secularization, and to what degree the process of secularization is a result of the protests. So that's one of the kinds of questions that we have been trying to answer. And the fundamental issue, the fundamental difficulty is much the same as when trying to understand any kind of social phenomenon, really. Which is that, of course, you're interested in a range of social mechanisms, but any social process is a process that goes through people's heads. So any social process is a cognitive process. So you have to worry about cognitive mechanisms. Now, of course, these are usually described at very different levels, and it becomes very difficult to be able to keep in mind both these kinds of mechanisms and the interactions between them. Now, historically, this kind of what's known as a causal thicket, right? You have causal connections going in all kinds of different directions. I mean, I think the last talk is also a very good example of a causal thicket and how difficult it is to pull apart all the different streams in that. But standardly, what people have been doing when they've been looking at this kind of phenomenon is quite simply they've been ignoring some aspects of it. So if you're a sociologist, you essentially treat human mind as a black box, and you simply look at the social forces that are occurring. If you're a cognitivist, then you look at the cognitive mechanisms, but you abstract away from the social forces. And of course, that's just not good enough, right? What you really have to do is you have to have some kind of a complex multi-level model which includes all these different mechanisms. And of course, human minds simply cannot construct and think through those kinds of models, right? So previously we've been doing the first thing rather than doing the second thing, and that is only really possible these days thanks to the kinds of agent-based models that we're talking about here, right? So that we can treat every single human being as different. We don't have to treat them as essentially a gas where every human being is treated as much the same. Right, so that's the difficulty, that's the topic, but what are the basics of the project? The basics of the project, which is called Religion, Ideology and Prosociality, Simulating Secularizing Societies, are that we have two main partners. We have the, God, I've forgotten the exact name, the Center for Modeling Social Systems in Kristiansand in Norway, and we have the Society and Cognition unit right here in Białystok. The whole project is funded by a grant from the Polish National Science Center, where the money is coming from Norway funds, which is why we have a Norwegian partner. The other good reason being that they're actually very good at this, right? So the project is funded to the sum of about 1.5 million euro, getting ahead of myself there. And it's funded for about 3 years. The basic idea is to use this project to develop long-term cooperation with our partners in Norway to develop the research capacity here in Białystok and to look at socially significant phenomena. And apart from that, the project itself is also connected to a number of other projects which are carried out with the cooperation or based from Center for Mind and Culture, which is in Boston, United States, and the Philosophy Institute of the Czech Academy of Science. Now, that's the sort of nitty-gritty of it, but let's have a look at what methods we're using. Well, the central method that we're using, it's not pointing to space, right? That's not what we're doing. No, the central method we're using is to build computational models of social phenomena. What exact models they are, I'll talk about in a second. But apart from that, thanks to the generous grant that we have, we're able to do a number of other things, which really help us to make sure that the data we are putting into the models is good data. Right? Thankfully, we're not working under the gun like Franciszek, so we can afford to take a bit of more time to get a bit more data and hopefully get interesting results that way. So the first thing we're doing is we're building a large database of data about various aspects of religiosity across a number of different countries and across a number of different ways of surveys, because it's a data set which is based on such things as the European Social Survey, the World Values Survey, and so on and so forth. So we're putting all of that data together, which has proved actually quite difficult, to then have a very large data set to be able to base our models upon. So that's one thing. We're also looking to a certain degree at other historical data, because of course the survey data that I'm talking about really only goes back to the early 80s. And we want to be able to see what processes of secularization looked like earlier in time. But that's all about getting data, processing data that already is available. We're also getting data of our own, partly through experimental methods and partly through just surveys. So we're using priming experiments to see how people respond to particular conditions, which is useful in a couple of the models that we're developing. We're also running experiments in a setup where we're using essentially a pseudo game to enable us to look at people's reactions. And finally, we are ourselves preparing a multi-nation survey where we're going to be looking at data from Norway, from Poland, and from the Czech Republic. Right? But of course, all of that data is all being gathered for the sake of the models. I mean, we're hoping we're going to get publications from the actual data gathering, but the main aim is to have good data for the models. All right, so what's the team? The team in Christiansand, we have Leron Schultz, who is from Texas. So that's one of our Norwegian colleagues. And the other Norwegian colleague that we have involved is Ivan Puga-Gonzalez, who will be talking in a few minutes, who is actually from Mexico. So another good Norwegian colleague. Here in Białystok, there's myself. There is our administrative manager, Alexandra Dudek, without whom we would be all lost. I certainly would be lost utterly. Then we have the postdoc, Andrew Atkinson. We have Łukasz Kiszkiel and Piotr Laskowski. We have Ewa Dąbrowska-Prokopowska. We have Paweł Łowicki the doctoral student Klaudia Komar, and finally we have Alicja Zawistowska and Radosław Piłat, where most of the people here are sociologists. There is a historian, there is a couple of psychologists, a philosopher. So a fairly mixed team, but there is an important lacuna here in Białystok, which is that we don't have anybody on the team right now with a very solid modeling background, which is proving a difficulty because, of course, we are developing the modeling know-how of the people on the team, but this is a very long process. It's not a process which takes a month or two, but it's a process which takes years, and we are wanting to have actual models coming out of the Polish side of the project. So we're very much looking for people with modeling experience who would be interested in looking at these kinds of phenomena. So Franciszek, if you're sick and tired of looking at COVID, I know a place where you could do a lot of interesting things. Right, and apart from all of these people, of course, we also have this guy on the team. No, not Chris Hemsworth. I'm actually talking about Thor. Right, Thor is actually an absolutely essential piece of hardware. It's the computing system upon which we are doing our computations. So perhaps this photo is a little better here. Now, just to be very clear cut, Thor is not the one on the right. Thor is the one on the left over there, okay? I know it's an easy mistake to make, but it's the one on the left. So yes, Thor is the computing system we have here. It's specifically designed to be able to be used for multi-agent modeling. Just a couple of quick data. We have essentially 128 cores there and 2 terabytes of RAM, which allows us to run through simulations very quickly. And this has proved extremely useful and allowed us to run much larger simulations that we would have been able to otherwise. Now, Thor, it was actually funny because we had the not annual, but every 3-year visit from ladies who were checking that all the equipment is at the university where it should be at the university. And the ladies asked me about the server as if they were expecting it to be under my desk or in my pocket or something like that. And I said, no. This is something that has to be situated in a very much appropriate location. It's located here at the Computational Center. And importantly, of course, it isn't being used full-time by us. So it is available for other projects to do their computations upon when we're not using it. All right, so let's get to the actual interesting stuff, the actual science. So what are the models that we are building? Well, just very quickly, the 4 models, or rather 4 phenomena, aspects of secularization that we are modeling, because in each case we really have been building more than one model. So we're looking at fuzzy fidelity. All of these I'll explain. I'm just giving the headlines right now. Secondly, we're looking at prosocial equilibrium. Thirdly, epistemic vigilance. And fourthly, error management. Okay? So I'll take you through each of these one by one. So first of all, fuzzy fidelity. This comes from the name of fuzzy fidelity theory developed by David Vos, who is a really excellent quantitative sociologist with whom we're very lucky to be working. What he's basically been arguing is that the process of secularization looks very similar in every society. And in case you're wondering what it looks like, it looks basically like this. To explain the graph, it's essentially a process which takes around about 200 years, where you have a change in the frequency of what can be identified as 3 different groups in the population. You have the highly religious part of the population, which starts off at around about 90–95% of the population. You have the group of the part of the population which is secularized, which starts off at about 1% of the population. And in between them, you have the group which can be called those who have fuzzy fidelity. In other words, they're not strongly religious, they're not particularly religious, they might not necessarily identify too strongly with any religious group, or they might not practice much, right? There are very different ways of being fuzzy fidelish? No, that's not a word. To have a fidelity which is fuzzy, but they start off at about 4% of the population. And what happens is, while the religious fall and the secular grow during the process of secularization, what you really see is an intermediate growth and then decay in that intermediate group, those with fuzzy fidelity. So David Vos is able to explain a lot of aspects of what we're seeing in terms of secularization by concentrating on that intermediate group. And very importantly, he's done a lot of work already on analyzing international surveys, which shows that this model fits very well the available data, where essentially you have different countries at different spots in that process. So why did it disappear? Okay, I pressed the wrong button, that would be why. So for example, you have Poland at about the year 80 here, where you still have a majority of religious individuals, but that's dropping rapidly. You have a rapidly growing group of intermediate, the fuzzy fidelity, and a somewhat more slowly group, the fully secularized. As opposed to Norway, of course, which really is through most of this process, and in fact is getting to the point where the fully secularized individuals are the largest group in that society. Okay, now this is a very interesting and important claim to be making, because of course most people, most sociologists, think that cultural differences, social differences, etc., mean that the process of secularization looks very different in every society. Whereas the claim here is actually the process is very similar in every society. The only difference is where in the process each society is. Okay? So that's the first model we're looking at. The second model is a model of what's called pro-social equilibrium. The idea here being that for the longest time, societies, large-scale societies, have persisted in what can be called a pro-social equilibrium. Now, the nature of this equilibrium is that the success of these societies depended on the cooperation of the members, the willingness of the members to be acting in a pro-social manner towards each other, where the effect of this behavior was that it helped to reduce the threats that were faced by members of the society, and in effect to reduce the levels of anxiety that the members of that society would feel. Now, this is relevant to the equilibrium because it's quite a well-known phenomenon that increased anxiety has an important effect on religiosity. In particular, that both in the long term and in the short term, it tends to increase religiosity. where a number of sociologists have claimed, and there seems to be fairly strong evidence for it, that at least in some ways, increased religiosity leads to increased levels of prosociality. So you can see that you have an equilibrium here in that if levels of anxiety grow higher, that drives up religiosity, that drives up prosociality, that helps the society to deal better with threats, so it lowers anxiety. If that gets too low, then religiosity drops, so does prosociality, and the threats, again, start to overwhelm the society. Where, of course, in the context of secularization, what becomes important is that you have other external institutions which ensure high levels of prosociality, quite independently of levels of religiosity. So in essence, they're kind of putting their finger on the scales, thereby driving up prosociality, driving down anxiety, and over the long term, leading to slow but steady drop in religiosity, which is not constrained any longer by the need to maintain this equilibrium. Okay, so that's the second model that we're looking at. Third model is called epistemic vigilance. This comes from theory developed by Dunsper and his colleagues, including very importantly Hugo Messier. Now, what they're saying is that human beings are primarily social, especially in our learning, in that most of the learning that we do is not individual learning through interaction with the natural environment, but social learning, where what happens is that we learn from other members of our societies about both the societies and the natural environment. So, to take a very simple example, I don't need to eat poisonous mushrooms to find out that they're poisonous, right? My father, my mother told me, do not eat these mushrooms, and I've never even tried them, which is a very useful thing to do, right? Especially if you're a kid, because learning this kind of thing firsthand is not a very safe or pleasant experience. Now, the thing is that social learning also opens us up to being manipulated by others. So that people might, for example, tell us that these lovely orange-colored mushrooms are poisonous, whereas in fact they're some of the tastiest mushrooms around, and they're telling us that they're poisonous because they themselves want to eat those mushrooms. Right? So while we make use of this wonderful resource that is social learning, we have to maintain a level of epistemic vigilance, where this vigilance can be based on content vigilance. So in other words, we're looking at the content of what they're telling us and trying to see whether it makes sense, it fits with what we know, whether it is internally consistent, these kinds of things. And we also can do source vigilance, where source vigilance is asking ourselves these kinds of questions like, is this the kind of person who would know about this? Do they have a reason to lie to us, to mislead us? Are they generally favorably inclined to us? Right? So we're looking at the source of the information to evaluate whether it's a good idea to believe in this information. Now, these two ways of carrying out epistemic vigilance both function in just normal, common, everyday practice, but in this model, we're looking at how that interacts specifically with scientific as opposed to religious institutions, where the idea is that depending on the context, depending on which kind of institutions you're dealing with, those two different kinds of performing vigilance become either strengthened or weakened. So, in particular, in the context of scientific institutions, you have a tendency for content vigilance to be the kind of vigilance that has focus placed upon it. So just take a very simple example. In many different sciences, what happens is that when you submit an article, a scientific article, the evaluation of it is double blind. So that the people who are evaluating the article do not know who wrote the article, so they cannot go, okay, this is someone who is a well-known scientist, therefore they must be saying something that makes sense, which would be source vigilance. But they simply have to read the content of the article and see whether the content of the article makes sense. And also, there's the other side of the double blind, which is that the people whose articles are being evaluated don't know who is evaluating them. So the idea being that the people who are evaluating them are freer to speak their mind rather than worry about any potential social repercussions for if they don't think that the article actually works. Right? But that's the idea with scientific institutions, whereas with religious institutions, the idea is that in their case, what happens is that the context tends to make people focus on source vigilance. Who is telling me this? Is this someone who is an authority in my community? Is this someone who performs appropriately to someone in my religious community? Okay? The point being that these differences are not arbitrary, they're not coincidental, they're actually connected to the very different functions that scientific knowledge as opposed to religious beliefs have. Primarily that in the case of scientific institutions, you're looking at knowledge that you're able to act upon in such a way that the accuracy of those claims, of those beliefs, is key to their functionality. And in the case of religious beliefs, if it is the case that their function is to drive prosociality, it doesn't matter if they're actually true. What's important is that they're believed in and they do drive prosociality. Right? To take a very simplistic example, if a bunch of hunters go off to hunt a stag, for example, in the forest, and they all believe that that if they do not cooperate, the spirits of their ancestors will punish them. It doesn't matter if there are any spirits of the ancestors. The mere fact that they believe in that motivates them to cooperate, and that in itself is functional. Right? The truth or falsity here is irrelevant. Right? So the term is that religious beliefs have non-analytic function, and if you have a focus on source vigilance, you in fact have the possibility of having a belief tradition which is non-analytic. It's not tied to the truth of those beliefs, because you get it passed on from one social authority to the next social authority. Okay? So that's the third kind of model we're looking at. The fourth one, the last one, and I'll be finishing up very soon because time is coming to an end, is the error management model, where the focus is on error management theory, which was developed by Marty Hazelton and David Buss. And the basic idea here is that in many situations where people are trying to make judgments, make decisions under uncertainty, there are very different costs of false positives and false negatives. If we can think about hunters again, you can imagine a hunter in the forest who suddenly hears a noise behind him, and he might think it's a tiger when there is just wind, which would be a false positive, and the cost of that is minimal, right? He will be scared, he'll turn around, perhaps jump up a tree, whatever. Or there might be a false negative. In other words, he might think there's nothing there, whereas in fact there's a tiger sneaking up behind him, where the cost of that mistake is potentially much, much greater. So the point that Hazelton and Bass make is that there will be a natural tendency to try and avoid the more costly mistakes, right? So in this case, to avoid the false negatives, right? Now, this is also connected to what's known as illusory causal control. In other words, situations where we think we can gain control, where in fact there is no possibility of gaining control. And this is tied to this methodology that I've just put up on the screen, which is a pseudo game where people are invited to move a cursor using a range of buttons across a matrix. And on some instances they get points, and some others they do not. The whole point being that the success at the end is absolutely random. They have no control on whether they will get points. But depending on how we vary the conditions of how often they get points, they exhibit behavior which appears to be at least certain aspects of ritualized behavior. So, for example, they press buttons that don't do anything. Or they follow a path which is absolutely unnecessarily longer than necessary. And so on and so forth, right? I'm not going to go into details of it, but essentially it is possible under laboratory conditions to, using very minimal methods, very minimal means, induce certain aspects of ritualized behavior in people. If some people are thinking that this looks a lot like Skinner's pigeon, that's because it does, right? This research is very much connected to that line of thinking. And I've pressed the wrong button again. Right, so the next point being, of course, that in situations where there's high levels of anxiety, there are high levels of threat, people are much more susceptible to engaging in various aspects of ritualized behavior, which again we can measure and look at under laboratory conditions. And of course people give a supernatural interpretation for this and then potentially develop belief or ritual traditions. The point of the models here, of the agent-based models, is that using the experimental data about individual behavior, we can then look at how those belief ritual traditions become common in our simulated societies. So in effect, really, this model is not about secularizing societies, it's actually about societies becoming religious. All right, so what results have we obtained? Well, as I said previously, mostly Ivan is going to be talking about that. I will simply try to answer the question I asked right at the beginning, which was, if you recall, is it the case that protests are motivating secularization, or that secularization is motivating protests? Now, we went and asked a group of people who are strongly supportive of these protests about the religiosity, and we asked them reciprocal questions, not reciprocal, asked them about their religiosity in previous times in their life. And one of the questions we asked them was, do you think that these protests have lowered your level of religiosity? And if I recall correctly, I don't remember the exact number, but I believe in the order of about a third of them said, yes, it did. So it looks, so the protests are indeed leading people to become more secularized. Well, there was an issue with that claim, because most of the people who said that their religiosity had dropped as a result of the protests had previously told us that already a few years earlier, their religiosity was at the lowest possible level. Okay? So in fact, what we found, well, first of all, analyzing data from the European Social Survey, we saw this is looking at levels of religiosity of different cohorts in Europe. The ages of the cohorts are given at the bottom. So from around 1985, 80, 75, 70, all the way back to 1940, I believe, right? What you can see is across the different waves of the European Social Survey, which are from left to right, the religiosity of a given cohort essentially did not change. So it seems like the phenomenon of secularization is a cohort-driven phenomenon. Essentially, society becomes less religious as the old people die, and the younger, less religious people come in. The only aspect where you do see significant changes in religion in a particular cohort is before age 25. That seems to be the period of socialization where people's religiosity gets set, right? And that's also what we found when we looked at the supporters of the protests, right? In most cases, their religiosity was set by about age 25. And of course, if we look, I did it again, 3 times, 3rd time lucky. If you look at this, this shows us, on the left-hand side, the religiosity at age 12, and on the right-hand side, the most recent religiosity, where you can see the flows between the groups, right? Massive flow to the last group here, which is religiosity 0. This was a group which was extremely highly secularized for Poland. Right? And what's more, this was a group which was extremely highly secularized for Poland before the protests began. So quite clearly, the evidence seems to be that it is the secularization that's driving the protests rather than the other way around. Thank you very much. We have 5 minutes for questions. Anyone? Okay. Yes, of course. And I think that's exactly what these people were saying, right? That it's not that they were becoming less religious, really. They were becoming more hostile to religion. Yeah. Yes, of course. Of course not. Of course, yes, absolutely. Yes, it is, religiosity is something that has many different aspects, right? There's aspects to do with behavior, so whether you attend church, whether you pray, there's also aspects to do with your beliefs, number of different things, and indeed questions that we did ask in this questionnaire that we gave them. But with the retrospective questions, what we did was we simply asked them, how would you judge your religiosity? And we left the interpretation to the people responding, right? So That's absolutely correct. And with the other answers that they give us, we're in the process of trying to work out what exactly they did mean there. Because clearly, they didn't mean that they come to believe in God less than they did previously, because they were very much atheists beforehand, most of them. Right? But yes, absolutely. Okay, well, most of the questions in the questionnaire were quantitative, right? So we asked the questions on a number of different scales, essentially. But we did have an open-ended question that people responded to very enthusiastically. I mean, it's usually very difficult to get responses. In this case, this was not an issue at all. Basically, we had a lot of people responding. I mean, this is the Facebook group Dziewuchy Dziewuchom, right? And there were lots of people saying, "Thank God, finally somebody asked these questions."
I know. Okay. I know the also.
Of course.
So, but my question was of the Franek.
Yes.
Gave the was limited to these answers.
Yes.
So these questions was about.
Mm-hmm. What we did was we put the retrospective questions about how religious you were when you were 12, 14, 17, right, and so on, right at the beginning, so that they would be working as much as possible on the basis of their own conception of what they would mean, rather than being influenced by the questions, very detailed questions that we asked them later. Right? And in fact, the question about whether the protests increased or decreased their religiosity was the very last question we asked. Specifically. Okay. To try and keep those two things as far apart from each other, so they weren't able to think, hold on, I already said 0, so I can't possibly say lower, right? Okay, cool. I think Philip had a question.
Yes, but it was from somehow different direction. I wanted to ask whether you already know if you're trying to construct those ideas from some lower level primitives. Mm-hmm. Like I seem to remember an article in some early number of Journal of Artificial Societies about building beliefs and passing them from generation to generation, and how false beliefs how help. So they tried to reconstruct that from pure hunter-gatherer thing. Mm-hmm. And there is some ideas about like Agent Zero by Epstein, about building those things from smaller stuff. So that's my question. What are your basic building blocks?
Okay. Well, that's really a question about the last two models, much more than the first two, right? Because I mean, in a way, the last two models are much more focused on the detailed cognitive processes that have to occur, right? And that's actually what we were going through right now. That's the process of conceptualization we're working through right now, asking ourselves these kinds of key questions. So my answer is not an answer, because it's basically saying, yeah, it's a headache. I know. We're trying to deal with the headache right now, right? Because, I mean, it's easy if you really limit the model to talking about very similar kinds of things, but the moment you try and extend the model to a different range of phenomena, you have to start making all kinds of very, very troubling, strong assumptions, which I think we don't have the data to really be able to say, yeah, that's how it happens. Right? So part of the problem here, I think, is the lack of data, which means that our conceptualizations are lacking. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Okay, look, I'd love to keep talking, but Ivan is waiting, and it's high time for him to be able to give his presentation. So let's see if we can hand over to him.
Conrad was mentioning, which is basically the fuzzy fidelity model, and the work that we have been doing for the last year, in which we have basically built a microsimulation and agent-based model to understand the process of secularization according to the fuzzy fidelity theory. So this is the work that I have been doing with all the team that Conrad has previously mentioned. And yeah, so the part that I'm contributing to this project is basically the modeling part, which is going to be the focus of my talk. So the outline of my presentation is the following. So I will start talking very briefly about the fuzzy fidelity theory. Then I will talk about what the age, period, and cohort processes are that are trying also to explain how secularization processes are happening. I will sum now then into what the microsimulation, the type of optimization experiments we did, and the target curve of religiosity decay that we use for the optimization experiments. Finally, I will go into the results of the simulations and then how we are now extending that microsimulation into an agent-based model. So let's start really quickly with fuzzy fidelity theory that, as Conrad already mentioned, was a theory that David Boas came up with in 2009. So this theory is what I will call a data-driven theory, because what he basically did is that on the basis of the questions that are asked in this European social survey, and the questions related to religiosity, of course, he categorized people according to religious, fuzzy, and secular individuals. And then after looking visually to that data, he managed to come up and stick the pieces of data together between countries, and he observed something like this, as you can see here in the graph. So as you can see here, what he suggests in his theory is that the transition between of the secularization process, so to say, so the transition from very religious societies to secular ones appears to happen by cohort, right? And that all the countries more or less have the same trajectory, but they may be at a different starting point, and that the whole process takes around 200 years, as you can see here on the graph, right? Now, the question that we have here at the beginning of this project was, okay, how is this secularization process actually happening, right? Because the data is telling us, well, this is how it looks like, but what is behind it, right? What are the mechanisms? And one of the simplest way of approaching this problem was first to look at three different effects that are basically what sociological papers usually look at when they look at changes within a society. And these are basically the, hold on, I cannot change my slide. So these are basically the age, period, and cohort processes, right? So if you look at each of them separately, so you can see here the age effects, that if you have here time and then here you have whatever trait you are actually measuring, what you see, if there is only an age effect, it means that during the lifetime of the individual, then there is a change in this trait, right? And it doesn't really matter when the individual actually was born, right? It can be born in the 40s, in the 50s, or in the 60s, but the change seems the same with age. Now, when you see a cohort effect, you see something different, right? So here you have time again, and then what you see is that there is no change in time for when you were born, right? But there is a change when between the cohorts, right? So this change here, as you can see here, it is decreasing between cohorts. And that's what you will call a cohort effect. Now, you may have things as a period effect. So a period effect is basically here what you see in a combination with a cohort effect. And what you see here is a period effect here when you see the down of the value of this trait that is being measured, right? And the period effect, basically what it's doing, it is affecting the whole population in a society. It does not matter the age of the individuals, right? And you may think about a period effect cohorts, and what we're measuring out every single year is the average religiosity of the population and the average religiosity of the cohort. And at the same time, we are measuring the proportions of religious, FOSIs, and secular people every time step. So, these effects that I'm talking about. So first of all, I would like to start talking about the period effect, right? So at 12 years old, these agents inherit the religiosity from their parents, and then thereafter, every year from 12 years old until they die, then if there is the period effect that it's on, then there is a decrease on the religiosity. So here we implement two different types, one in which this decrement is constant in time, and the second one which is dynamic. Right? So this decrement, it's a function basically of the religiosity of the agent. Now, what I want to drive your attention here is that we're having parameters here, right? So we don't know exactly what this decrement is here or how the values of this function actually work. So basically here I have a graph in which I show that, well, depending on the parameter values that we have here, the decrement can have different values. And we let this loose. So what we are trying to do is to kind of find out the best values of these parameters so we can mimic the religiosity decay that we see in the empirical data. So we do this with optimization experiments. So that's period effect. Then we go into the cohort effect, which we basically have two different ones. So, and these cohort effects, it happens only when individuals become 12 years old and never again, right? So the first one is that individuals have inherited the religiosity from their parents with some specific bias. And this bias basically comes from a weighable distribution that, again, we can parameterize, right? So we can control the scale and the shape of the distribution that you see here. Again, this is in order to kind of mimicked in the optimization experiments to mimic the decay as we see in the empirical data. Now, the second one, again, is the social, a cohort effect with the social environment. So in this case, you have that individuals inherit the religiosity from their parent minus a decrement. But this decrement is basically modulated by the proportion of a specific aging category in the population. So this can be the proportion of religious persons in the population or the FOSI persons in the population. So we call this an environmental effect because it's basically the composition of the population at the time in which this process actually goes on. And because these shares evolve in time, then you may imagine that this decrement is also varying with time. So finally, we come to the age effects. So the age effects do not happen in isolation. They usually happen in combination with the period and cohort effects. And here we have two different ones, right? One in which the religiosity may decrease with age, and the other one in which it increases with age. And again, what this age effect basically is doing is basically modulating the value of this decrement, right? Or this increment, depending on what age effect is on. Again, we can parameterize this, and so we can get different types of age effects according to the age of the agent. So these can be linear or these can be non-linear depending on the values of that the parameter takes. And the same for the increase, right? All right, so after all this, we came with a table in which we kind of have all the different age period and cohort processes that we have or we implemented in the microsimulations. Some of them are just by themselves, some of them have age effects or even a double age effects in them. And then here, each of these processes, as you can see, have a parameter that we can optimize to mimic the religiosity decay that we see in the empirical data. So what is this actually? So this is what we are trying to mimic in the model. So this is coming from the fuzzy fidelity theory of Boas, which basically here you have the cohorts in the x-axis, and here you have the religiosity level of each cohort on the y-axis. And what you see is basically this. And this is coming from the empirical data. And this is actually what we want the model to reproduce, right? And that's why we do the optimization experiments. And the way we do the optimization experiments is that we're using the optimization engine of any logic. So what this engine basically does is you have the parameter space, and then it starts sampling the values of this parameter space. And then we have an input function, right? So this input function we give to the engine, and then at the end of the simulation, it calculates a value that can either minimize or maximize. In our case, we are basically looking at the residual sum of squares between the religiosity decay that is coming out of the model against the one that is expected, right? And then, as you might imagine, we're trying to minimize this because the lower the value of the residual sum of the squares, the better the fit of the model and the target decay curve, right? So we do this for each of these processes that I showed you in that table. We basically run 5 experiments, 5 optimization experiments per process, and then we take the one that is the best, right? So we take the combination of values that is the best, and then we rerun the model 100 times with the best combination of parameters. And then after doing that, we overlay the model results on the expected decay curve. And this is basically what we see here, right? So here is the data, in black is the data that is coming out of the model, and in red is basically the curve that we were expecting according to the fuzzy fidelity theory, right? So you can see that basically some APC processes fit the data better than others. And in our case here, I'm highlighting 2 basically. And these have to do with the cohort effect, in which the social environment is basically dictated by the share of fuzzies in the population or the share of non-religious in the population, right? So now these are the ones that are giving our best fit after we have found the best combination of parameters. But this is not the only thing that we can do now. So we also have these dynamics, right? So now we have fit the decay of religiosity curve according to the fuzzy fidelity theory, but we also have these from the same theory, right? So we have how the shares of religious and fuzzy and secular individuals change over time. And now remind that we did not optimize the parameters to fit these curves. So what we are doing here, okay, now we have found the best optimization or the best values for these parameters, and then we rerun the model and we look how the model compares to these shares. And this is what we see. So you can see here the hollow points are basically the results of the model, and the solid points are here are the what we would expect according to the fuzzy fidelity theory. Again, what we see here is that the 2 previous ones are the ones that are basically fitting the best, right? So again, it's a cohort process with the social environment mediated by either the fuzzies or the non-religious population that gives the best fit. What have we found so far? So we have now that the microsimulation, so we have shown that is able to discern between different age period and cohort processes. So as you saw from the previous slide, if each of these processes basically gives a slightly different result and sometimes a very different result depending on what is in there, right? Now, when it comes to the fuzzy fidelity theory, we have that the declining religiosity and the dynamics of the categories of these agents are generated basically by a simple rule. And that is that the children inherit religiosity from their parents, and that this parental influence is moderated by the social environment, right? So here we have what is called a micro feedback loop, right? Micro in the sense that the inheritance process is basically going from at the individual level, right? From the parents to the children, and then when the children get their own offspring, then they will inheriting, and so on and so forth. And macro in the sense that whenever the inheritance process is going on, how much of that religiosity is actually passed on into the offspring is mediated by the environment. In our specific case, by the proportion of either FOSIs or non-religious people in the population. All right. So the micro simulation, it's actually telling us, well, the social environment it's really important. So what is this social environment, right? So in the agent-based model that I will present next, we're trying to disentangle this. So we're trying to disentangle the social environment. So how are we actually doing that? Well, the first thing that we did is basically we look at all different secularization theories that are out there, right? And here I just put basically a few of them that are actually relevant for our purposes. And after a lot of thought, we basically settled in 5 of them, which is existential security, education, religious socialization, pluralism, and freedom. And I'm going to go through each of these now. So what is existential security? Well, the main argument of existential security is that whenever you are living in an uncertain environment or an environment that is insecure, individuals have these anxiety feelings, right? They may have these worries or discomfort because they are basically living in an uncertain future, so to say. Now, then, because of this, they may go into religion, right? Because religion, in some sense, is comforting, right? It gives you some hope. It gives you something to keep on going, right? But what happens when you are living in an environment in which you are highly secure, in which basically you may say your existence is secure, so you haven't nothing to deal with health because probably the government provides most health services, or it provides good employment, or it provides good education, right? This is basically the case of developed countries, right? In which you could say that you have your existence secure. In these cases, basically then the argument goes, well, there's no need for religion because basically the government or the society is providing a very secure environment, right? And this is basically backed up by data. So if you look at the correlation between the Human Development Index and religiosity, then you can see that the higher the Human Development Index of a country, the lower the religiosity on average. Then we come to education. And the argument for education is that the higher the attainment of education, the more analytical, the more critical the individual becomes, right? Education conveys this kind of scientific thinking that may be in contradiction with religious beliefs, right? So those individuals which are highly educated, therefore, may start to decrease those religious beliefs. Then we come to religious socialization. And here, the emphasis is put basically on the social context within which individuals actually develop, right? And this social context may be at the macro level, for instance, at the national context, or it can be at the micro level. Basically, who are you hanging with whom you exchange opinions, with whom you are actually interacting. And the idea here is that this social context is going to influence your religiosity, right? So you have that these social interactions that you have mainly during the teenage may affect your religiosity, right? But on top of this, you have also what is called the national context or the macro factors. And we believe that these may be influenced by other macro variables such as freedom or pluralism. So what we mean by pluralism what we mean basically is whether the environment in which the individual actually develops or it grows up, it has the presence of multiple belief systems, right? Because if you have a religious belief and then you are confronted with different religious beliefs, then there is no way in which you can claim, well, my religious belief is the sole truth, right? So then you may start wonder whether you actually believe is actually true. So the presence, the mere presence of different religious systems may undermine your own belief in your own system or in your own religiosity. The next one is freedom, which is basically whether the environment in which you are immersed in actually allows the expression of your beliefs and the practice of your beliefs, right? So this comes, this is relevant, for instance, in countries in which one religion is basically it's favored than others, right? So you may think, for instance, of Muslim countries in which Islam is the one, the religion that is favored, and then the others may be just forbidden, for instance, right? So this is what we mean by freedom. So the main goal of the agent-based model is basically to recreate once again the secularization process. But we're going to try to do this, we're going to try to zoom in a bit more than in the micro-simulation. So we're going to try to look at the specific countries and specific time periods. And we're going to include all these relevant environmental factors, the ones that I just mentioned. And by doing so, we hope to understand how these factors contribute to the secularization level, to the secularization process, sorry, at the individual level, right? So we're going to use empirical data as proxies for these environmental factors, and we're going to once again use optimization experiments to find what values fit better for these environmental factors, what we call scaling factors. So what is this agent-based model about? So here I present again the cycle of the model, which is basically we're going to start again with a population in which we had a distribution of religiosity, age, and education, which is relevant for the country that we're modeling. And then we go into the model loop or cycle. So here, individuals that are above or equal to 75 years old, they are just going to be removed from the population. Then we come to what we call the education effect that will only happen to those individuals which are within the 20% of education of their generation. Then it comes to the marriage and reproduction process, in which for the marriage, for instance, we have some specific homophily rules which are regarding the age and the religiosity of the individuals. And then after these events, then it comes, if individuals are 12 years old, then will inherit the religiosity from their parents, and that's where we set the existential security effect, right? Finally, those individuals between the age of 12 to 25, they are going to have a peer interaction process where the other macro variables are going to come into it. And then individuals once again will start aging, and then the loop is repeated again. So how are these macro variables or environmental factors influencing the religiosity? So first we have education effect. So if the agent's education, for instance, is in the top 10% of the population, or the cohort, sorry, here should be of the cohort of the agent, then you decrease the religiosity. If it is between the 10 and 20%, the religiosity will be decreased, but a little bit less than those in the 10%. And then the other percentage, the 80% that is below, won't change the religiosity according to education. When it comes to existential security effect, this only happens at 12 years old. Now here you may think, sorry, I forgot to mention that for all these variables, they're going to range between 0 and 1, right? So if existential security is above 0.5, then that means that the individual is in a somewhat safe environment. So then it's going to decrease its religiosity. If its existential security is below, then it's going to increase its religiosity. Finally, we come to the peer interactions. So from 12 to 25 years, individuals hold peer interactions. And every time step, they are going to select individuals for that peer interactions for which we will going to make networks, right? And then these networks may be composed of religious individuals and other peers. So those religious peers basically will have similarity in the religiosity, and then they're going to have an age difference of plus minus 2 years. Then the other peers only will have a similarity or homophily regarding the age, but nothing related to religiosity. And this is where the other variables basically come in, right? So pluralism basically is going to determine the number of religious and other peers in the networks, right? So if pluralism equals to 1, so that means that there is a lot of diversity of religious systems in the system, then no religious peers will be selected. If pluralism equals to 0, then the network is just going to be composed of religious peers, and then if it is something in between, then the number of religious peers is going to vary linearly with the decrease of pluralism. And then we have freedom. And what freedom is going to do is going to determine how much influence your religious and other peers have on your own religiosity, right? So if freedom is 0, then you have that the influence of religious peers is going to be really strong. It's going to be much stronger than that of other peers. If freedom is 1, then other peers and religious peers is going to have exactly the same influence. And if it is somewhere in between, then the influence of religious peers is going to vary linearly with the decrease of freedom. All right, so that's basically how we have set up the model to work. And then I just want to end up telling you a little bit about what the proxies that we're going to use for these environmental factors. So we have been looking for data to fit into the model. And for existential security, we settled on child mortality. We explicitly didn't use the Human Development Index because the Human Development Index includes some other variables such as education or such as GDP or such as human rights scores, which may be confounding with the other variables that we're basically fitting into the model. Child mortality basically is highly correlated with the HDI, so we are confident that this will help us, or it will be a good proxy for existential security. So basically, we have a lot of data for a bunch of different European countries that it's going to be very useful when we start running simulations in the model. Now, pluralism, we have a religious diversity index that we obtained from the World Religion Database, and this ranges between 0 and 10, with 0 being no diversity and 10 being the highest diversity. And then as you can see here, we have data starting from 1900s for a bunch of different countries, again, mostly all European countries that I selected here. And then we have a lot of variation. So we're going to use this as a proxy for pluralism. And then finally, we come to for freedom, which we are basically using the human rights score. Again, we have quite some data for a lot of different countries, and there is some variation on this data, which is going to come very handy when we start running the simulations. So that's basically what we have so far, and then our next steps will be to choose the countries, so which countries we actually want to mimic in the simulations, and then start running the optimization experiments. So once we do this, we hope that we will be able to recreate the secularization process for some specific countries. And by doing that, we will get a better understanding on how these different environmental factors contribute to secularization process at the individual level. So that's what I have for now. And now I'm open to questions, although I'm not entirely sure.
Okay.
Just to start with a very simple question, do you vary the reproduction number, I mean the number of children, according to religiosity? because this might be a factor I didn't notice if it is taken into account.
So now I hear the first question, and yeah, so I'm not sure if Conrad already answered this. Of course, for the micro simulation, we didn't take into account the number of children. So what we were trying to do in the micro simulation is to keep the population stable. But in the agent-based model, we are taking into account this. I just didn't go into it just because I didn't have the time. But what we are doing there is that the more religious the agent is, the higher the fertility rate. So we will have the highest difference will be 3, meaning that the most religious people will have on average 3 individuals, and the less religious people, being completely secular, will have on average 2 individuals. So yeah, so we are taking that into account.
Just another question, maybe very similar that I gave to Conrad, about the diversity of the religiosity. Because, I mean, I think there are, for example, some kinds of religiosity which are increased by education, not decreased. I mean, do you take into account this diversity, or maybe you plan to take into account this diversity in the religiosity? Because as now I see this very simple one factor entity or variable.
All right, so when it comes to education, yeah, here I'm going to rely on what my co-authors or experts actually are saying. And after a long discussion, when we were building this agent-based model, we basically settled on these top 10 and top 20% of the educated people being decreasing in religiosity. I know that education may indeed, in some cases, increase religiosity, but I guess, and I'm gonna ask Conrad to answer this question better, but my guess here would be that this is more the exception rather than the rule, and that's the reason why in the agent-based model we did it the way it is.
Okay, to say a bit more about that question, talking about different versions of religiosity is problematic because obviously you want to get at something which is really actually quite hard to measure. So really the way of doing that, which was really a proxy for doing that, is you simply look at various aspects of religiosity that are measured. So you can look at attendance, you can look at private prayer, you can look at these kinds of standard measures, right? And that is, of course, a much more detailed and in-depth model than just one that has a single variable from 0 to 1 religiosity, right? So what we've decided to do is, I mean, we're working step by step. We're now looking at a model where there's going to be a single value for religiosity, which of course is a gross simplification, right? Of course it is. But it's supposed to be a step to see, okay, we do this, we do it this way, let's see what that gives us. And once we have a grasp on that, we can very much then use all that data we are gathering about all these different variables to try and then build a more detailed model. Right? Because, I mean, one of the things that we found, for example, in the analysis of the data is that the standard ways of measuring religiosity, they seem to behave in very similar ways in terms of how they drop off as secularization occurs. There seems to be a very clear order to how they drop off. So these things are very much connected in that way. But yes, that's definitely where we want to take the model. I don't know if it's going to be able really to do something as in-depth as looking at different kinds of religiosity of the sense that I think you had in mind. Okay, so that's a limitation. Sorry, there was a question at the back.
I think that there is also the question of psychological and sociological processes, yeah, included in the secularization. And from my point of view, for example, as a social psychologist, the only realistic process is the process of socialization. I mean, I think I'm talking about the processes you put into account. For example, insecurity can push people into the secular direction. When society, when the government is, or when the society is secular enough, is secure enough. So when you are insecure, you can go into the religion, but you can go also into the atheism, into the unreligion. So this mechanism of being becoming secular because of insecurity is psychologically non-realistic, but sociologically, of course, it can be.
So, yeah, I will let Conrad to answer your question here, because I'm not a sociologist, neither psychologist, so I wouldn't exactly know how to answer this. So as far as I understand, and from the discussion with the experts here that I was working on religiosity, we came up with this process of existential security, because I think that's what the data basically says.
Okay, well, to answer the question, yeah, the process of socialization is absolutely key. I think the data we've seen in the European Social Survey shows that very clearly. I'm completely satisfied that the key period is until 25, right? And the model that is being developed here, even the ABM, is relatively simplistic at the individual level, right? I mean, we don't have a system dynamics model of the cognitive system running at the core of the ABM. And really, to be doing any justice to the complexity of these kinds of processes at the individual scale, you'd have to have a systems dynamics model at the individual level. We don't have that here. Okay. I think the work we're doing on the error management theory and on the epistemic vigilance theory is a lot stronger on that side. Okay. Now, the actual connection between security and secularization, well, I think the link, the causal links here are going to be really quite complex. To a certain degree, I mean, I tend to favor quite strongly the existential security theory, right? But to a certain degree, I wonder to what degree the results one sees at the social level are to do not with that being a specifically important causal process, and more as the security being, in many cases, the limiting factor, where there are a number of other causal processes involved, right? So that's one thing. Another thing, of course, is that when you look at different societies, the correlation between secularization and security seems to come out much stronger at the level of the societies than at the level of the individuals, right? Now, there's a number of different things to be said there again, right? I mean, one of the things that I think is a very important one to have in mind is that if you have a highly unequal society, where some people are actually secure and some aren't, even the people who are secure are aware that there's a lot of scope in that society for them to lose that security through various processes, right? So, again, a lot of thought is required, and this kind of work can only be part of the overall process, right? This isn't the only thing that we should be doing. There's a hell of a lot of different things we should be doing, a lot of different kinds of data we should be gathering, and really, this kind of modeling has the aim of bringing all of that together and testing it in a way where all of it is on, on a level field, essentially, right? Okay, there was a question up the front, and I think this is going to have to be the last one because we're running over time.
You are treating religiosity as a continuous variable. So my question is, when looking at, say, histogram of religiosity across the population, can you see any natural breakdown into the three categories, or it is pure arbitrary?
Well, for this you have to look at questions that basically David Boas based its categorization of individuals, which is basically three different ones. I think one of is how important is religiosity in your life. The other one is whether you consider whether you're affiliated to any kind of religion. And I think the third one has to do with how often you go to church. Now, from these questions have like 11 points sometimes. Some of them have 7 points. Some of them have 4 points. And then on the basis of this, David Boas categorized the people into religiosity, into religious, forces, and seculars. Whether there was a real drop or a real, as you say, in the distribution, whether you really can see how these categories, if these categories stand out from the distributions, I cannot tell. This is something that we should ask David Boas. But I think, and I'm not sure, maybe Conrad knows a bit, that he has done some analysis on the ages on which you categorize these individuals. And I don't think that has major effect on how these dynamics of religious, secular, and forces individuals happen.
Okay, yeah, I mean, because with the original paper by David Boas was using one data set.
And yeah, of course, the categorization that David did, it's arbitrary, I believe.
So the way that David originally did it was on one data set, was on just the very first wave, I believe, of the European Social Survey. We've done it on 9 different waves of the social survey, European Social Survey, where there's a different set of questions available to us. So we've actually done it differently. And we've managed to get results which are quite similar. And we've, in fact, now been going, because again, we have an even larger data set now. What we're looking at to do is to, on the one hand, do sensitivity analysis to see how different ways of defining these groups changes the overall results. And my initial, not yet based on well carried out studies, but my initial thought is that it really doesn't matter that much, right? But we're also going to run along the side of that is to try, and I think this kind of gets at your question earlier on, because what we're going to try and do is we're going to look at how the people in that whole data set clump together, whether there are any natural ways of dividing them up, quite separately from the religious, fuzzy, secular distinction that David's been working with. So again, we're looking on the basis of the available questions, these pretty standard questions, but perhaps we may end up coming towards the kind of issue that you were asking about earlier. All right, everyone. Look, Ivan, thank you very much for your time. Sorry about the great delay in you being able to hear what we're talking about, and thank you for bearing with that. It's now time to have an hour and a half's break. I think it's okay if we start 15 minutes later. What do you think, Ola? That should be okay? All right, so we now have an hour and a half's worth of break, and then we're going to continue with the second session for today's meeting. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, so I worked up from the title of the presentation, which was not created by me, and at some point I decided that I need to change it a little bit, and I added this this question mark because okay, I needed to look up what's the best practice, because everyone knows until they play a discrimination game, and then it turns out that we have different focal points here. So the best practice is something that's generally accepted, but there's really not such a big field of making large-scale agent-based models, so that there's no general acceptance. Like, we are little islands, so there's nothing that's generally accepted. And also it says in Wikipedia, which is the official source of wisdom, do I need to that it needs to provide superior results, and everyone's results are different. I mean, results, should that be maintainable, or should that be easy to recreate down the line in, say, 25 years? Or should that be something that's valuable from operational perspective, or should it be something that gets sold? Okay, it's easy to say superior result when you're working in the enterprise. So actually the best practice, the only thing I found that was common to all those descriptions was that best practice is something that if you do it, nobody questions you. So it's really a way of covering your back, so to say, and say, okay, no one ever got fired for, oh, notice, I needed to export this presentation just seconds ago. So it's stealing me the punchlines. I was supposed to, you know, show line after line, but I didn't manage. So the approach I took was just look at some best practices from industries, which are actually industries, and that have some sort of best practices which already work, and I thought I'd share some perspectives and perhaps experience from how those best practices work in the field of agent-based modeling on a scale, and maintaining an operational model, which is, I believe, something quite special. So I'll skip that part. It was, I tried to show something from a demo scene from the 90s, how certain approaches to coding evolved, and certain records were broken on the number of animated points on a sphere. And coders, programmers, they were called coders back then, and young coders, like 15 or 16 we were back then, we tried to break records of animating more and more points on a sphere, and managing to get high throughput. It was using like very old hardware in a very special way, and the records got broken, but usually it was by cheating, like noticing that there is some symmetry somewhere, or thinking that, okay, I can do that I can cheat here, I can look that up, I can use this or that pattern, and the results were usually amazing, but they were not maintainable. So like for some approaches, oh, it works perfectly, but for amazing reason you cannot add color because you're already using that part of a bit field for something else. So so the first thing to notice is that we can only have one of the polar opposites. We can have a very fine-tuned specialized model which does one thing extremely well, and it's like we see, especially nowadays, we see people using GPUs and the GPU clusters to do massive simulations, like crowd simulations with a lot of agents colliding. Like we have hundreds of millions of agents and then collide in different ways, and we need to model that. And these are very, very fine-tuned models, but so for some cases that works well. And then there are models which are built not to implement an idea that was already there, but models which we use as tools for exploring certain space of ideas. And these are models we want to change, because when you have this huge crowd simulation running on a GPU, and then you say, oh, and one person in every 1,000 is wearing sneakers, and one person in 500 has a cell phone ringing and rings the other person on the other side of the crowd. You cannot do that. There's no way to squeeze that additional logic into a highly specialized model. So, and it's a decision you have to make, because if you don't make this decision, then you keep going around in circles. You first you generalize, then you specialize. You generalize, you specialize, and you're not getting anywhere. So it's a trade-off of sorts. So let's look at two successful industries that come to my mind and that I have some experience with that are using those interesting approaches. And the first is the gaming industry. And okay, let's face it, that industry has got the simulation thing down to perfection. Let's look at the modern, massive online multiplayer games with space physics, spaceships, collisions, missiles, and network communication, compensating latency, and that's all happening with like millions of things working inside the model, interacting. And then if we don't think about the network aspects, when we look about, when you think about a game like Grand Theft Auto 3 and upwards, those are large sandboxes, or even a Dwarf Fortress. These are large, like roguelike games. They have extremely complex rules, because once you have a fighter who has a knife that can be used against a werewolf, but the knife is made of silver, so suddenly it has this additional effect on the werewolf, because werewolves are allergic to silver. And then I've been on a roguelike game conference like 11 years ago, and someone was mentioning that he got surprised about his own system, because a player managed to get a silver ring on a piece of stick using just the basic mechanics and use that to defeat a werewolf. Because and the game knew that, like it was an emergent aspect of the game, and he said that this was the most rewarding experience about writing a roguelike game. That was Jeff Light, and the game was called Powder, I think. It's still playable, probably. So so this is an industry that and also the games, the rules, especially concerning like spells and fights, the rules change all the time. And there's one. So that's one industry, and the other one would be telecommunications, including the mobile payment systems, especially the billing systems. They are quite complex. Like imagine that someone has 17 bonus points left over from last year, and an active promotion, you and your children, and an active promotion, cheaper 20% calls between 10 and 6 a.m. and something, and then suddenly that person is making a call using roaming, and you get this radius package, and the tools need to like evaluate the package and bill it and say, okay, so where do we take the points for? Do we charge? Are we using the bonus points? And this is all working on a tremendous scale on huge machines. I'll come back to both of those. So the gaming industry created something called entity component system. It was quite a rage around 15 years ago. And one of the biggest game engines called Unity started with something close to ECS, but now they're moving like all in ECS. That may be for the questions. The idea is that we structure all the simulation around just one type of something. It's called an entity. And the only thing that an entity has is identity. So, like an integer. There's entity number 17. What is it? A household, an agent? Like, we don't know. We don't. There's no watch inside. I'm not sure if how long I have. Anyway, okay. So the special like aspect of entity, and the only aspect is that it's something that has identity. It can be an agent, it can be a relation between agents, it can be a place where agents stand. It's something that can change during a simulation, and it's not a constant input, or something that we think might change. There's a fine line. Oh, so there's an entity, and yeah, we can represent a household or a person or workspace as an entity, but as such, the entity is just a number. We need to know it's a household. So entity acts as a bag, a container, a set of components. And components are basic domain logic units. So these are like, we can think about them as data structures. So each entity can have only one of each kind. So when you have an entity, we can ask, what's the position? What's the name? What's the person details? What's the household aspect? So each entity can have any set of those, and they are the ones that store data, but they're not ever associated with any sort of behavior. They're just containers for data. And here's the first one thing. They're stored separately as in tables. We can think about it in many ways. We can think about it as a relational database, or we can think they are data frames. So we have a huge data frame for if someone's working with data frame tools like NumPy. And best of all, we can query them, and we do not need to go through any sort of object graph to get a grip of them. So we can instantly ask, okay, give me all the entities that have positions. So we instantly have access. We can make a loop over all positions, and we don't need to care if those positions are agents or households. So when we make a visualization code, in many cases, we do not need to know anything else, right? So the third thing of this practice, this pattern, this way of writing is a system, and I lost the slide for that. Probably. Okay, so these are examples. So like this is actually taken from old version of our agent model. There's an entity, and that entity can be named because our entities are named. So and they can have a location, northing, easting, and then they can have age and sex. And when they have age, they also have sex, and when they have sex, they also have age, because that's the person aspect. And okay, they can be a complex. A complex is a building. That's the meaning of the word used here. So it can be just a building which has a lot of households inside. Okay, so if we want to write down the names of entities just to see what entities we have on the screen, we just go through the named component. And we know that there's entity 7 that has such name and such. For a person, this name would be first name and last name. For a school, we are using a real registry of schools taken from the Ministry of Education. So for places like schools, the name would be Przedszkole 117 imienia Janusza Korczaka, or something like that. So it's a name. Same with location. Like an agent can have a location, and a household can have a location. They are homogeneous. So what we have here is how an object graph built for those would look. So it's always an entity connected with its components, and those components can in turn point to other entities. And then we have systems, and systems are our pieces of logic. They are not inside the methods. They are not tied to objects, for a very good reason, which are probably it's not there are good reasons. It's not for fun, but the main reason is composability. So we can compose systems, and we cannot really compose two definitions of objects. If I have two class files, one is an agent from one sort of an agent system, and one would be a class for some other, they have different properties and different methods, I cannot compose them and create one simulation which runs both types of logic at the same time. Here, I can just take system, like this is an example. When I define two components, one for position and one for velocity, I can have a system which I'd call a movement system, and that system just takes a position, a velocity, and just adds the velocity to position, and that's a system. And when I can reuse the position and velocity, and I can reuse the movement system in a different model, I can test them separately, and I can build a library of such solutions. And also I have and yeah, that's about the composability. I have did I move outside of the, yeah, thank you. Just wave. I believe it's something, it's called the combinator, and the original name for the pattern was a composite, but basically I can have a function which takes two systems and returns a system. So for example, I can have a function which takes two systems and returns a system which runs the two original systems one after another in sequence. So I can sequence systems and build bigger systems. Right? I can parallelize systems, because when I have a movement system and some system which does something to like decision making of an agent, there is no need to run them sequentially, because they're never in conflict. So I can build all sorts of composites out of those systems. And then systems are managed. When I write a single function and I just give it away to the framework, and the function just adds velocity to position, the function knows nothing. Well, it's that in enterprise this pattern is called inversion of control, because this system knows nothing how to get the data from any sort of store, and it knows nothing. Is it are those executed in parallel or one after another? I don't know, and I don't care, because I'm not writing the loop. I'm just writing the system, and the system should get those details. So it's managed. There's an external, I can add externally things like indices. So like I can take a system and only run it in a certain bounding box on a map. And the system does not need to be changed, because the system only tells you, okay, if you have something that has those two aspects, those two domain components, velocity and position, this is what happens, right? And the rest is outside, so that the systems are manageable. And also the systems allow us to partition our software. And there's this one thing about software engineering which seems to be a recurring theme, and everything comes back to divide and conquer. I mean, you abstract things away and you build modules and you hope that the abstractions don't leak. And you can compose them. So we can package those systems separately. We can test them separately. And if we have an operational model, we need to have a pipeline that does integration tests and unit tests and so on and so on. So we can test those aspects separately. We can run them in smaller case and in bigger scale. We can version them separately. So we have a very clear separation of what we do. Like we have some very preliminary work on some social aspects, like Rafał could say something more about it, but we were thinking about like emulating, for example, fear of vaccination or decision making in terms of vaccination. We hope, we didn't do it, I admit, but I think that we should be able to just press a button and drop the vaccination system and vaccination components into a running simulation of the COVID, and just have those things work together. Like this is the holy grail, composing systems. And then we can fit even more and then do even more. I'm not sure if that slide should go here, but I saw this tweet a week ago. It's from Brian Getz, who is probably one of 2 best Java programmers in the world and the Java architect at Oracle. It's taken out of context. But, okay, he said that one of the things that comes to... it's often said that one of the things that people often perceive as a solution to a certain problem is, let's build a domain language. And usually, it's not a good solution because designing a proper domain language takes a lot of time. And effort, and it's really an art, and there's very few people in the whole world that I would trust with designing a language from the ground up. Certainly not Larry Wall. So this is something we don't do. So this is an anti-pattern. So after this anti-pattern, let's look at another family of lessons learned, this time from the enterprise. Do I still have around 10 minutes? Okay, good. Okay, so these are the 2 interesting ones that that turned out to be the ones interesting to us. They are so they're like iterator, like no one even notices them anymore. But let's just but they're probably not known outside of the very few people interested in architecture patterns, and the programmers, we usually just use them without thinking about them. So the idea is we have the actual data store, and we do a business transaction. This is what happens in the billing systems. This is what happens in the on the bottom part of the first slide. So that's the enterprisey part. So usually we never mix business logic with changing data in the store, which is something that mathematicians often do. And when we make like small scale things, we often do that, but we never do that in the enterprise. We always copy the data out of the data store. We store the data in temporary objects which represent the data. And then after we are done, after our unit of work is done, then we store them back. So we have this object, this place, where we store the information about each thing that was changed. And this thing is usually a row in the database, right? So if we're making an operation on an invoice that has a number of items on it, we'd usually just copy out the whole invoice into objects in the memory. We would not execute updates and inserts and deletes on the database. We change the business objects, and then we do all the operations in batch. So what we are doing and what we think is what makes sense, and that was already tried in making of the new social structure. So there's already plenty of code used in production that does that, is we combine those 2 patterns. So what we have is like a huge, you could imagine that it's a huge data frame that stores components. Yeah, you can pretty much say it's a data frame. We have 2 implementations, and we have plans to see if we can use mmap to save some time for a quick loading of stuff. We can use JLarge arrays, which is something built in ICM. And we used to use JTable, which is a data frame library for Java, but it turned out there's not much advantage in that. But that's all hidden away. That complexity of the backend, how we store this data frame, that's all hidden away. For all the model nodes, the data frame can be distributed across a cluster. We don't do that, but that's one of the things we could easily do. Or it could be partially persisted to permanent storage and partially in memory. So there's the data frame, there's the unit of work, and the unit of work begins with a system says, okay, let's have a single agent. And the unit of work retrieves the data from the components, and it puts it into a real object, which, yeah, we do a lot of allocations. But that's strange, because, yeah, there's a huge price in that. But modern garbage collectors are really good at allocating storage for a very short amount of time. So we do a lot of allocations, but they all live in the space figuratively called Eden. So they are young objects which do not get, there's no reference counting. They do not get visited by the garbage collector. They're just burned down. The whole Eden gets burned down and new objects are allocated. It's extremely cheap. It's nothing like allocation in C, where special structures need to be created. So we allocate this graph of objects, but only the part necessary. We have 40 million agents residing in memory as a data frame. But any given moment, we have 100 agents, like 50 agents, as much as possible. Perhaps we take the household and we take all the members of that household because we need to see something, right? So that's stored as objects. And then when we say, okay, our work here is done, then the unit of work copies the data back from the objects into the data frame. And that adds us this additional place where we can put all sorts of additional management. Because that's where we can, for example, for free, plug in things like logging all the changes or making diffs of what has been changed. So actually this system is managed enough so that we can have a file which for every change of every attribute keeps track of that. So this is something we can use, and we'll experiment on that, but this is not yet done. We'll experiment on using this place. It was done in the enterprise, like akka agents work like that. So we'll use it to move differential data across the cluster, so we can stop simulation at any given point and just send out diffs and split, and for example see how certain parameters could be changed from this point. So such mechanisms are those are low-level mechanisms which we get for free just by using this unit of work idea. We never work directly on the data frame. Copy out, copy in, copy out, copy in. Yeah, there's a price, but it's not as steep as we might imagine. So no idea. There's a question mark. But what are the what I would, with my current experience, advocate as the best practices for large ABMs? Domain model described in terms of components. That's our logic. That's the attributes. Domain logic described in terms of composable systems. Operations on data abstracted away using unit of work, identity map. And an environment that hosts all of this. So what I'm pushing for is something like application server for IBMs, or for ABMs, right? So like sort of a framework, an environment. By the way, that would be a good place for the slide about languages, because it seems that every couple of years someone says, okay, let's build a platform to run complex simulations, and they always start from the IDE part. It always has all those nice buttons and easy language, an easy way of writing hello world models. I would not bet on that approach. I think what works is what was done with Jupyter Lab. It's something that grows from the bottom up, from the actual programming language, not top down. When Jupyter Notebook, immensely successful product, was created, it wasn't created like to make things. They didn't create the language. They didn't create the libraries even. They just said, okay, we have this low-level libraries and actually cool language. Let's just make it useful. And they said, okay, it's easier for someone who's a scientist in the field of sociology to learn a real programming language than it will be for programmers to maintain an artificial programming language, which will be crippled because no language created for a simulation of agents can be as mature as Python or Java. Okay, so this is it. Thank you very much. This is roughly what I wanted to say. Any questions?
A technical question. So for each operation, you basically copy data from the permanent structure to the temporary structure. You make operation and then you copy it back. I mean, it makes sense for me for business logic, because that for business operations. But my experience as a programmer is I'm teaching CUDA, and basically what I'm saying my students, avoid transfers from memory because it is very inefficient, because the computational power is much bigger than the memory subsystem. So I mean, basically it means that the computing power is now irrelevant. What is important is memory, yes?
Yes, and this is exactly the reason why we are doing that. And it's a bet. And I don't know, because I can imagine that it goes both ways. But just for a second, when we have a model, which is one of those highly specialized ones, we just put the data so that you can process it row after another. That's what you do with GPUs. But here it's a simulation, and suddenly you have clusters of people who work in the same school, but work in a different powiat or in a different part of Poland. You cannot put them together. You cannot. So actually, I think that copying out those things and keeping them in memory for the duration of the operation, and we do that in batches. For example, every 1,000 operations we do the batching. It's not like for every low-level operation. The nice thing is that systems, they don't care. They work equally well, whether we do the read-write for each step or for every 1,000 of steps. And actually, this is something we can tweak. And sometimes I see it works, for some operation it works better with save load per operation, and sometimes for a batch of 10,000 operations. And it's probably has to do with the hardware as well. So that could be something sort of it could be nice runtime self-calibration. Yeah. So then you have all those things in a memory close together. So for the duration of the operation, I think it's more cache-friendly, actually, to copy out all the data and have it close together for the duration of, for example, processing the graph. And then you put that back.
Okay, that reminds me.
Because then you need to copy out the whole page.
Yes.
Right? Then you need to use the whole page, and you don't have everyone on the same page, and you cannot really sort them because that would put you on the specialized. Of course, when you specialize, you can be 100 times faster. I'm just saying it's 100, not 100,000. I mean, we are thousands of times faster than NetLog or like ordinary VPAST, because I've seen that. Like,
okay, thank you.
Next question, please. All right. I'm afraid I have no questions myself, so thank you very much, Philip.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm Witold Trudnicki, and I'm self-invited because I am co-organizer with Konrad of this event, and I will present something that has nothing to do with agent-based modeling, but I hope that it can be useful for modelers, for analysis of the simulation. So I will give very short introduction to machine learning, and this is more or less my offer that if you of the things that I'm showing interesting or useful, then maybe we could do something to share. So I will start with very short introduction about supervised learning. And so we have how we see it. I mean, this is not necessarily very general, but for me it is how I see this. So we have a data set. There are several objects that are described with variables, and there is a special variable called decision variable, class variable, and we want to build a model that predicts this variable out of this is what we do. And we also can have some additional goals. Yes, this general goal to make the predictive model is general goal, but we can have some additional goals. For example, finding the minimal set of variables for building best models, or we can rank variables, or we can find all variables that contribute information on decision. And obviously, when you construct your agent-based model, you know exactly what variables contribute. But then when you run simulations and then you analyze the data, that may turn out that some variables actually are irrelevant. Yeah? May be like that. So this is why I think it may be useful, especially if you have big complex simulations. Okay, so this is my picture how machine learning works. Yes, we have data, we have decision, and us and the black box model. And these black box models sometimes can be quite important. Your decision of life and death, or say fortune or prison. Yeah, and actually, this is something in this model that makes decisions. Yes, this black box is someone who makes decisions. So you are not king. You have a wizard that makes decisions for you. And actually, it seems that you are no longer necessary unless you know what this wizard is doing. This is something that I would like. This is called explainable AI. We would like to understand what this black box system is doing. So maybe this wizard is no longer so important. He's just giving some information, some hints, and you can understand the data in this black box. So you put this wizard back to the black box, but you still have some understanding of the data. So this is why we think that identifying the variables is important, and why it's not only technical to identify the variables that are useful for building models. It's important to really gain understanding what this model do and why. And this our feature selection. Usually, most people think about feature selection as finding the useful feature. We want to use all variables that are relevant, and then analyze them, and then do gain some understanding, and then build models. This is foundation of our approach. It's not necessarily that we achieve it at every moment, but this is our goal. And talking about relevance, this is also something very interesting. Usually people think that something what is relevant is always relevant. Yes, this is so-called strong relevance. We need this variable to be added to the system, so we describe the system. There is also so-called weak relevance, that the variable is relevant in some context, but it may be not relevant in another context. And with our experience is actually that this strong relevance is not... In our cases, in our data that we analyze, usually we don't have any strongly relevant variable, only weakly relevant variables. Why? Because we have multiple closely correlated variables. So any of them is sufficient to build the model, so then it is weakly relevant because it can be replaced with another. It's not necessarily true for your systems. I'm talking about my experience. And this is example that was actually produced by Krzysztof. This is from our paper, that we have a system when we have 3 variables. One is strongly relevant in general sense because this is a copy of the decision variable. Another is the strongly relevant variable that is somehow, well, I'm looking the word, it's destroyed somehow. The information is distorted by adding noise. And then we have the noise variable that has no information about the phenomena whatsoever. Yes? But in the situation, so when we build a model using two variables, so when first we can see the response, the information of the model on this curves. This is so the rock curve. So when we use this strong variable, we get a perfect classifier. We simply know everything about the system using just and adding additional variables doesn't help. And when we have this noisy variable, we get almost perfect classifier, very good classifier. From the noise, we don't see anything. We basically have a random signal. Then when we combine these variables in pairs, when we combine the perfect variable with, don't get any additional information from adding information to the perfect variable. But the most interesting situation is when we don't have this perfect variable. We have noise and variable that is informative but noisy. So when we add the noise to the non-perfect variable, we get improvement of, because we have original noisy signal and the noise. All together we get signal from these two variables. So although noise is not informative generally, but if you have the noisy signal plus noise add information to this noisy variable. So this is phenomena that is, this is counterintuitive, but it is true that you can have some information from noise even. And the noise in this context is weakly relevant variable. It can add your information. And so on the other hand, you look at the data that some adds the information, that it is denoising, nothing else. Okay, so there are several algorithms for feature selection, several classes. There is a so-called filtering that you apply this before you build models. There are built-in feature selectors, like in say, Lasso or maybe in random forest. So this algorithms already do some feature selection on the fly, and there are wrappers that can be used, that are using some classifier to rank the importance of variables. And we are now working on this approach. I have some quite good success with this wrapper, and it can be used for analysis of the data. I will show it later. So why this all relevant feature selection is relevant? Again, because it can contribute to this is our specialization. I'm advertising our services. And so there are several classes of algorithms. Maybe I will it. Well, Lasso is well known, Elastic Net, random forest. Okay, so how you basically wrappers have the training set. You do this is a figure from classic paper about wrappers for feature selections. So how it works? You basically run your classification. You find which variables are useful for this classification, and then you you may rank their usefulness, and that's how the feature selection works. So why we need something more than simple filters, especially that simple statistics? Because when they work for simple cases. When they are simple, say the variable is described with a very nice Gaussian distribution, and you can see and that's clear. You can make simple test, but there are several cases when the situation can be a little bit more complicated. For example, you cannot really discern this situation, the red from dots from black dots using single variable. So single univariate filter may be not sufficient for. Maybe I'll skip this example. I'll skip. Sorry, this is maybe too complicated. This is too complex. So basically what we need, not necessarily single univariate filters. We need filters that take into account multiple variables, and this is what we have developed. This is my first take at this system 2 years ago. This is an algorithm called Boruta, which is a wrapper around random forest classification algorithm. It was done with all these guys. Actually, I have done the first version of this with being at Uppsala with Jan Komoros and listening to very interesting presentation of Jacek Koronacki about random. His algorithm for feature selection that was in development, but it was still at that time a few months ago, and we had pressing problem to do this kind of identification of important features for some bioinformatics problems, and then I hacked the solution using random forest, and then it turned out that we have quite good idea. Then we developed with Miro and Alek Jankowski developed another version which is more efficient, less ad hoc, and Miron also wrote a Boruta R package, and this is something that I would recommend to you. This is general library in R that can action. How it works. We add some additional variables to our system, not only original ones, but we extend the system by adding more variables that are by design non-informative. We run random forest. We rank the variables according to their perceived informativeness or relevance, and then we repeat this process several times. And then we simply check whether the original variables are better, more relevant than the best artificial one. So best non-informative. In this way, we can identify variables that carry true information. And this Boruta works on any type of system. Basically, if you have a table with data, you can run random forest on it, Boruta as well. This is very universal. It has some disadvantages. I'm quite proud of it because this is really used by people are really using the tool, and it gains traction. So really, you will be in a good company if you use it. And I also got some prizes from praise from one co-worker of Leo Breiman who created Random Forest. That she wrote me that this is good work. I'm really proud of it. Probably this is the best prize that I had for this. But the problem with Boruta is that it is heuristic. classifier dependent. So if some features are not very useful for random forest for some reason, and they may be not so important, or that there are many problems with that this is classifier dependent. And also we are running usually on systems that are not very numerous objects, but very huge number of variables. 40,000 of variables is standard. And then it starts to be quite slow. Build very big times. So for that we have designed new algorithm which is called MTFS, and this is a filter that uses information theory, can identify variables that are involved in complex interactions, not just simple linear dependence between variable and decision, but also complex interactions. And we have also the library in R. And if someone is really interested in moving this to using this in different language, then we have almost ready version in Python and Java and Scala, but we have no incentive to finalize it. So maybe if there is someone who will like to use it, then it would be incentive for us. Okay, so this is based, as I told, it's based on information theory. It can discover interactions up to couples of 5 interactions together, variables together, and it uses a good statistical test to discern truly informative variables. So it is quite solid and based on quite solid theory. And we also do discretization in rank space. So basically how it works, we have the system, we discretize it in the rank space, and then we basically count what happens, the number of objects in each class in buckets, and then we do some computation of information entropy, which basically means counting dots in buckets. And then we do some computations, relatively simple computations of conditional information entropy. And well, maybe there are some theory. I would like to show some results that, these are results for immune response in chicken. We see that these variables are non-informative because they follow the theoretical model of non-informative, and then we have some informative that are certainly different than those ones. We have also found that for neuroblastoma, the analysis that is quite recent, and I will not disclose what these are because it could be patentable, but we can see the clear difference between this part of figure and this part of figure. The red dots are unfortunately people who have not survived. So we could identify variables that are involved in interaction that could discern because between people who will survive and who will not survive. And this could be used for designing some test for diagnostic test, but also one of these genes could be eventually a target for medicine. Why I don't want to talk about more details what it is, because this could be patentable, possibly. Don't know about that yet, but okay, I was too quick. I talked before the slides. So we could discover that only due to this complex two-dimensional analysis, we could discover that these both variables are very important. That this really they contribute a lot of information, allowing to turn between survivors and non-survivors. And we use it as a basic tool. All papers that we published regarding cancer and drug-induced liver injury and some other subjects are based on library as our tool. And this also is quite robust procedure involved. I mean, we are using cross-validation, feature selection, model building, etc. This is quite complex procedure that sometimes is quite computationally intensive. I mean, basic classifier runs something like maybe less than 1 minute, but altogether that can take a few days of computation to make a robust result estimate of the uncertainty of results. We elaborate procedure. So yeah, we have published several papers on that and applied that in different goals with different goals. So this is the team. Krzysztof, who is present here, who was co-author of the main paper. Szymon, Paweł, and Andrzej are students from the University of Warsaw at that time, who written the very fast implementation of this MDFS in CUDA. Radek Piliczek is our main developer of the library, works at the University Center. Aneta, Wojtek, and Agnieszka are my co-workers in the Department of Bioinformatics, and we have external collaborators from Bydgoszcz and from Rzeszów who gave us data sets. We published together papers. So theory and tools were published. For Ruta, 3 papers. For MDFS, we have published tools also quite recently. And the last message is that we are looking for co-workers. We hire for the project that Krzysztof is heading for at the University of Białystok, because we have a project together with Jagiellonian University in Krakow, and that is devoted to analysis of microbiome. And we are set to extend the MDFS library to better suit this particular research problem. And we are looking for postdoc, computer science, mathematics, or maybe natural sciences, engineering, or maybe other fields. What is important? Programming. Important, and proficiency, statistics, and obviously fluency of English. So this is what we are looking for, and maybe someone hears that and is interested in joining our team. We would be for your attention. Open questions. And basically I was advertising us. This is shameless advertising, because I'm looking for collaborators, not only for postdocs but also for collaborators who will give us interesting research questions.
Okay, so do we have any interesting research questions here? Franciszek.
Regarding because you are one of the first person that from whom I heard of XI, so the explainable AI, and now this is quite a broad and important movement, mainly regarding deep networks,
deep learning,
so deep learning networks, so deep many layer networks. What are your experiences in that field of ML?
Very quick, close to none, because we are not doing actually deep learning. One of my students from the University of Warsaw actually have done quite interesting, elegant work in using deep learning for analyzing transcription factors, but we have not published this yet, and we have to finalize this at some time. But the problem with deep learning is that it is not really very well suitable for the type of applications that we are dealing with. We have usually very small number of objects. We have, say, if we have 500 samples, then we would be extremely happy, yes, because this is a large data set. And deep learning, you have some statistical data about patients, but still you have this data, and not just decision that is based on nobody knows what. So I was doing this explainable AI before the term was invented, yes. In a sense.
We were doing it before it was cool.
Yes.
All right, next question, please.
So maybe I have a...
I have a question for you.
Okay.
I definitely have a
great.
question for you. Right, so you're talking about large data sets, right? Now, it just so happens we have one handy, right? So this is the data set that I've mentioned several times, that we've putting together data from the European Social Survey, European Values Survey, World Values Survey, and the ISSB, where I forget what the actual acronym stands for. Now, Piotr, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's about 1.5 million individuals. Yeah, right. About 1.5 million individuals with 4 variables in terms of religiosity, and a few other demographic variables. What can you do for us?
I have a question regarding this. So I'm going back to the first slide, yes. So can you represent it in this way?
It is represented in this way.
So
right?
Do you have, do you have clear decision variable?
Okay, what do you mean by a clear decision variable?
So you say, well, for example, these are gentlemen and ladies. I know, I want to see what are the differences in data men and women. What are the differences? How can I, and maybe some complex differences, only the obvious ones that univariate, I could separate. If you have this type of questions, and what is in? Obviously, as I told you, we are specializing in data where here we have something like more than, not really no more, but usual work with data that has something like in the order of, say, hundreds. And here we have tens of thousands of variables. We can handle different types of data.
Yeah, because I mean, it has the opposite structure. It has 1.5 million objects and only, how many variables per person? Yeah. But I mean, it's in the dozens, right? Yeah.
Okay, we could analyze this. I'm not sure technically if we would need to do some tweaks in our code, because we are generally working with data that is binary. I mean, binary decision, yes, no. And then we have the code that works best in a GPU is limited to 65,000 objects plus. But on the CPU, it is not. And with that number of variables, I think we can easily handle that on CPU, so no problem.
Okay. We have to talk.
Yeah, sure. And generally, maybe according to not only data from the real world data. Once I have one paper that we have years ago, we have analyzed simulation crashes of the software that runs simulation of climate systems. Software is so complex that the creators of the system didn't know why it crashes. There was original paper about that using artificial intelligence as well, and then we have analyzed this system using our own tools, Boruta and Random Forest, and so the space was something like 20 variables. We were able to identify which variables are responsible for these crashes. So there are some cases that the model, I don't say that it crashed technically, it crashed, it went away, I mean, to non-physical behavior. Some stupid behavior, and it was so complex that creators didn't understand why it goes away, so they analyzed it machine learning, and we done this analysis with Boruta and Random Forest, getting slightly better results. Good enough to be published, yes. So that was quite interesting. So if you have simulations like that, huge simulation parameters that go strange way. So maybe you just want to analyze results of complex interactions. Not how you design it, but how they look from outside. Yes. What is the effective interactions parameter? Effective. What happens? System analyze something. Also goes for your simulation as well. But this was the goal of my question regarding 1,000 runs of your code with obviously you can do this with Miron using
no, this is possible to be done, but of course it requires quite large computational resources. But
you say that you run your one simulation.
Yes, but we have them, so
yes.
we need to run on a large part of the Okeanos or any other computer.
Obviously, if it
if
you have the that could be asked by
first we need to think of the plausibility of such a study.
Yes. I'm just I want because it is something that not necessarily all of you would think about. Yes, that this is possible. This type of analysis is possible, plausible, and maybe if you think about it, maybe we could find something.
Great. All right. On this note, we should be finishing, but perhaps before we finish, Witold has kept on reminding me to say that yes, we are also looking for people to work with us, primarily, as I said earlier, people who have modeling skills, because that's aspect of the team where we have a relative weakness, but other possibilities also, right? Where you have a large team, but it's a large project, and we're very much interested in seeing new people come aboard. So, on this note, thank you very much for coming. It's been a great day, and I hope those of you who have a little bit further to travel to get home have a nice and safe drive. Thank you very much.